In 4, 3, 2.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us for the Texas Public Policy Foundation's live stream discussion of Off the Rails, Did Austin Mislead Voters for Project Connect? My name is Robert Henneke. I'm the Executive Director and General Counsel of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Wanting to let everyone joining us online know, first of all, that we will be taking viewer questions. If you will submit those through the social media that you are watching this live stream on, we'll try to get to those towards the end of our program. But I'm very excited to welcome and introduce for this discussion, first of all, my colleague in studio with us here, James Quintero, who leads our Government for the People policy initiatives and is an expert on local government issues. And then joining us remote is my good friend and our other panelist, Bill Aleshire. Bill's the owner of AlshireLAW PC. He was formerly elected as both the Travis County tax assessor and Travis County judge. But more importantly for our discussion here today, Bill is the lead counsel in the recently filed lawsuit, Dirty Martins versus Watson, which is the lawsuit that challenges the legality of the City of Austin Project Connect project that we're going to be discussing here today. So, James, Bill, welcome to both of you. Thank you for joining us. First of all, Bill, I've got to compliment you on great client selection. Dirty Martins is an icon in Austin. It's one of my favorite burger places in the city. I hope an occasional cheeseburger here and then comes with your representation of Dirties. So thanks for joining us. And let me just ask you to kick it off in just, for those who may not be fully aware, explaining first of all, just what is Project Connect conceptually that we're talking about?
Yeah. Project Connect is a rapid transit project that was presented to the voters in great detail in November of 2020 for both light rail component, a commuter rail component, and bus rapid transit component. And there was the voters were presented with public information by the City of Austin that was holding the election. The City Council actually passed a contract with the voters and attached to that contract a map that I would call the 2020 original map plan, and attached to that a timeline of 13 years for completion of all the bus rail projects. And I'm sorry. And so that's what voters approved. And it was at an estimated cost of $7.1 billion with around 45% of that being expected to come from federal funds. And the bottom line of what happened was that the City of Austin got permission from the voters, as required by the tax code, to make a huge property tax rate increase that year, the biggest in the history of Austin. It was almost a 21% increase in the maintenance and operation portion of the city's property tax.
And the premise of that, Bill, James, I want to come to you here in just a second. The premise of that property tax vote was, as you mentioned, the promise of what the city proposed in the Project Connect project. So, James, if you could actually just highlight for me what's a little unusual about that, because typically when we're talking about infrastructure votes, we're talking about bonds. We just had an election where voters approved and rejected bond proposals across the state, but that's not what we're doing here. So just kind of tease out where that difference between what we typically see and what happened with the Project Connect initiative in 2020.
Yeah, for the city's own reasons, what they ended up doing is they put a proposition in front of voters to permanently increase the maintenance and operations tax rate. And what the audience should know is that there are two basic types of taxes in Texas. You have your maintenance and operations portion, which is supposed to pay for your day-to-day expenses at the governmental level. And then you have your interest and sinking tax rate, which pays for infrastructure effectively, and debt service. And so what the city did is they creatively engineered this M&O tax rate increase so as to siphon away a certain portion of monies away from the public and then effectively funnel it through something known as a local government corporation, which is a quasi-governmental entity with not a lot of transparency nor accountability. And in so doing, by funneling these M&O funds to the LGC then had the ability to kind of creatively use these monies maybe outside the conventional norm. And so what the LGC intended to do was effectively go to market, go bond for some of the monies that they needed, and then use those M&O revenues to service the debt. And so, one thing that I do want to mention too is you look at some of the gymnastics that are happening within this Project Connect proposal, and they're really fantastic, both intellectually and in creative workarounds in terms of the law. And you got to wonder why. Why is it that the city is going to such lengths to do all of these various schemes? And one of the things that I found embedded in one of the city's budgets are these satisfaction surveys. And for me, this was very telling. What these satisfaction surveys revealed is effectively no one is happy with the transportation system in Austin. And so what I think happened is city leaders recognized just how abysmal most people felt about the transportation systems. And so they had to go to the public with something truly aspirational, truly paradigm shifting in order to try and move the needle on some of those satisfaction surveys. And I just want to read maybe one or two. In 2019, this is how many people were satisfied with the traffic flow on major highways. 5%. 5% of respondents were satisfied with traffic flow on major highways. Traffic flow on major streets was a little better, 13%. And then my travel time is predictable. Just 28% of people were satisfied with the predictability of their travel time. And I assume that 28% basically was satisfied with being stuck in traffic for, an hour plus every day. So
let me, Bill, to you, and pulling this into, a lot of our audience are not attorneys. And so at a layperson perspective, this lawsuit that you have filed says that what's happening today violates the law, is illegal. What's the premise of your lawsuit saying that what the city of Austin and the Project Connect initiative is doing today is illegal? Can you explain that for me?
It's because of the way they fund. It's because of the way they fund it. They could have avoided the situation they're in now if they had gone out on bonds backed by sales tax, for example. If Capital Metro had used its authority under the Transportation Code for a rapid transit system and used the Metro rail system in Houston is funded with sales tax, but voter approved bonds for sales tax. So they could, as James correctly admit, they had options to go out on a bond project. They could have used property tax. But it would have been not maintenance and operation. It would have been debt tax. So what's illegal about it? Because they chose to use the increase in almost 21% increase in maintenance and operation property tax, they're covered by Section 2607 of the Property Tax Code that requires them to get voter approval of an amount of increase in property tax for a particular purpose. And the city could have gone out and said, we've got this vague vision of what we want Project Connect to be. And so if you think we just ought to, along the way, have some money available to spend on this vision, then vote for the tax increase. But they didn't do that. They instead gave a very detailed plan, maps showing exactly the routes and what was funded and what was not funded. And they even called it an initial investment because their grand plan for Project Connect was actually over $9 billion, and they only proposed $7.1 billion in that election. So the bottom line is this lawsuit is standing up for voter control of their property taxes. That's the bottom line. And because they were required to get voter approval for Project Connect, they have to either stick with that plan and do what they promised, what they contracted with the voters to do in 2020, or easy enough, go back to the voters with a plan that is both feasible and legal. If the city wanted to pull down the property tax they've got and go back to voters for phases of bond elections, even using property tax, but INS or debt service property tax, they have that option available today. And if they did that, it'd moot this lawsuit.
Let me ask you, Bill, because there's a lot of legalese in there, but I really want to crystallize this point for our audience that's watching, because maybe people are listening right now and saying, but hey, the voters approved it in 2020. Let's put a really focused point on the bait and switch that's happening here. And if you can articulate for me really the problem between what the voters approved in 2020 and what is happening now, that is the point of the technical arguments you're making about the differences in the contract there, because what's happening now bears very little resemblance to what this contract that was made with the voters 3 years ago, right?
James, I think James has a chart that we used in our lawsuit that we might put up that really demonstrates a lot of it. But here are the highlights of the you know, if cost had gone up a little more than what they told the voters, or they had to make some minor adjustments, we probably wouldn't have a good legal basis for this lawsuit. But the change is so dramatic that we cannot believe that current law would allow a governmental body to do what the city of Boston is doing. It's so changed. But if we could put that graphic up.
It's up, Bill. You just can't see it. Oh,
okay. Then let me pull my copy. And what's not, those are the numbers showing how much of a decrease the people are getting in terms of light rail. There's a lot of people that voted because of features that are no longer in the 2023 replacement plan. For example, the blue line proposed in 2020 connected to the airport. And the maintenance facility was going to be across 71 directly from the airport in an industrial area. And now that blue line does not go. What they're funding now does not go to the airport. It only goes to a stop they call Yellow Jacket, which is in the Montopolis residential neighborhood. And that is where they've now put the maintenance facility. Another major feature in the plan was the underground tunnel. It was an underground station under downtown Austin to prevent having the rail line on the surface of 3rd Street. It was a huge part. It's $2 billion part of the overall budget to have an underground major train station with live music and restaurants and all kinds of stuff there. But it also kept the train traffic off of the street level. That's gone. The orange line going up Guadalupe and Lamar was going to go all the way out north across 183. But they didn't tell the voters that because it crosses the red line, that intersection had to be either it had to be either underground or a bridge, and there was no funding for that. So when they proposed that north end of the north-south orange line, it was not even feasible. It wasn't funded. They couldn't cross the red line. And that was also another potential location for the maintenance facilities out north in a relatively underdeveloped area. They also went all the way south. They're not going south past Old Torf. They were going to Stasny. So when you look at what's been taken out and what's been put in, the other major thing they did, and I apologize, I don't have my copy. Let me get it up here. In order to get federal funding, they've got to compete for very limited federal funding for light rail with other cities. And one of the key criteria is what is the cost of construction per mile, and what is the cost per rider. And if you look on that chart, you'll see that this project is considerably less efficient than the original. And there may have been voters that thought, well, wow, we're going to get so many more. We're going to get a ridership of 81,700 light rail riders. That's traffic off of the streets. Well, my co-counsel, Rick Fine, voted for it, not because he was going to use rapid transit, but he thought, okay, that'll get 81,700 people off the streets. The replacement plan only has a ridership projection of 29,200. That's a 64% decrease in ridership. And yet, on the other hand, the capital cost of building just the rail was $3.8 billion in 2020. That's after you take out the underground station. But now it's $4.85 billion for fewer miles. The bottom line being that when you look at what are the odds that this project's going to get federal funding, it is dramatically decreased. Because now, instead of a cost per rider of $46,512, it's $166,000, a 257% increase in the cost per rider. So the efficiency, the quality of this project has diminished so much that I hear that they've known inside ATP in the city of Austin for some time that their odds of getting federal funding have just evaporated.
And I've got
they're not telling the public that.
Man, I've got an anecdote on that, Bill, before, James, I've got a follow-up question for you, but I know that the Project ATP was in Washington, D.C. this week, actually up there, hat in hand, begging for more federal dollars. And I was told yesterday by a staffer that worked for a member of Congress that they met with, that part of their feedback was kind of being incredulous about the fact that the proposal doesn't connect to the airport. And at least that one office, that one staffer was telling them, are you guys kidding me? If anything, you need to start with the airport and go back to Austin, but this is absurd, you know? So it's already being met with skepticism, just, you know, even in addition to the inefficiencies you have. But James, your reaction, because here now, and I think the point of what Bill was saying is that the projected construction cost is more than was projected in 2020. But now the proposal, it's not just a little bit shorter. It's 51% shorter in terms of track and rail line. At what point, if you're thinking of like a judge or a member of the public or something, when does it not resemble the original proposal? I mean, in teasing out that, like, this is not just a little bit different, but where do you see that line to where, a finder of fact would say, we're volleyballs and tennis rackets here. We're apples and oranges. We're not even talking about the same concept anymore.
Great question. And yes, I think there are serious questions about the city's ability to complete this project, especially if the federal funding component is withdrawn. I don't see any opportunity for the city to be as ambitious and bold as they proffered in the very beginning. And so, all of these things are very troubling, not only from a taxpayer perspective, but also from a commuter perspective, right? I mean, this city has done so abysmally poorly at expanding and providing necessary infrastructure upgrades that, this initial concept offered some glimmer of hope, I guess, in a little bit of ways. But, I'm going to be watching this lawsuit very carefully to see what a court determines on the question of whether or not the city should go back and ask for voter permission again. I think, for a layman like myself, I think the answer from a legal perspective is yes, they should. But I wish we didn't even have to get to that point, right? It should be, as a matter of ethics and good governance, we ought to have our city officials step forward and say, look, guys, we proposed one thing, and due to unforeseen circumstance or whatnot, we had to go a different direction. So we want to put this up for public vote again. I think that's the right thing to do. Whether or not that's mandated by law or not, we'll see. But just as a matter of right and wrong, I think it's very clear that city officials should go back and ask for permission.
James, that's a great segue because, Bill, I've got two follow-ups to you on that, specifically kind of on ethical questions raised in your lawsuit that I want you to explain. One of which, and you've touched on this before already, but you talked about the bus rail maintenance yard being relocated to Montopolis, and your lawsuit compares that to what you refer to in your lawsuit as the infamous 1928 master plan. And I understand that the Montopolis community really feels betrayed by this relocation of the bus rail maintenance yard. What are you saying in your lawsuit in terms of what is wrong with that, more so than just moving from one part of Austin to the other?
That's why, in addition to Dirties, who has its own concerns about Project Connect, former Senator Gonzalo Barrientos, current County Commissioner Margaret Gomez, and Poder and local Montopolis neighborhood President Susana Almanza are also plaintiffs in this lawsuit. They're outraged by it. I call it Austin's historic sin for the way the city has treated the residents of East Austin. And gentrification is destroying a lot of these communities. And in 2020, the site they have now, as of June, selected for the maintenance yard was one of 7 that was evaluated, and it ranked 4th. And one of the reasons it did is because it said in the analysis that this site was in a residential neighborhood and the use of it for a maintenance facility would be incompatible with the surrounding area. And Austin has gone ahead again and done that. And their city council member was briefed on this and didn't object. So that's why other activists in the community are stepping up, because they're brave and they're gonna say not without objection. I think that location is going to be one of the first things that will actually ask a court to enjoin continuing on it, because that was not exposed to the voters. And I think there's a theme here that the things they're taking out, the things they're putting in could have made a dramatic difference. And I hope a judge would look at that and say, yeah, it's not just that you made a few changes, but if you put this plan back to the voters and paid for it this time, instead of only half paying for it, there's no way you would pass this. And so I think that's important. The other thing, to follow up just a bit on James's point, I have said, I don't know for sure that we can win this lawsuit because it is such a unique situation Austin created. We're having to make rather unique and unprecedented legal arguments. But the other thing I hope the legislature is watching is whether or not their intentional, strict separation between what property tax for maintenance and operation and versus debt service can be used for actually works. Because James calls it transferring the money to the local government corporation. I call it laundering, trying to launder the money to the local government corporation, and whether or not they can get rid of that basic tax code restriction on how you can use that money. They're taking maintenance and operation money and using it for purposes through ATP that the city of Austin clearly would be barred from doing.
Let me ask you two quick. We got 4 minutes left in the discussion, Bill. I want to make sure we close with my final question. But before we do that, and to your point, your lawsuit mentions that $21 million of funds that were designated for anti-displacement services have been spent, but have not been spent for those purposes. What is the city doing with that money? And what is the overall issue of transparency in terms of the other millions of dollars that have been spent on Project Connect, and we don't know where that money's gone?
One of the things that attracted voters that otherwise might not have been attracted to vote for this was that they had set aside $300 million for anti-displacement funds to assist people who, because the train system, as opposed to a rapid bus system, requires dedicated additional property that has to be condemned. They realized there were going to be businesses and residences that were going to get bulldozed, not just dirties, but in East Austin as well. And so they wanted to have money available to assist those folks in being able to relocate. That's what the anti-displacement money was. Well, first of all the money is supposed to be independently governed by and administered by the local government corporation, Austin Transit Partnership. But in this case, they're kicking back to the city all of the anti-displacement money for the city to spend. And the city has spent $21 million buying housing, either low-income housing that's already there, and now the city's buying it using this source of funding instead of affordable housing bonds that voters have otherwise approved, and apartment complexes that are not in the path of being destroyed.
Wow.
Their connection to Project Connect is impossible to see. And so I think that's another way that the voters have been cheated, and including people who really were sensitive to the environmental impact the rail system was going to have, and they thought they were getting it mitigated, and that's not how the city of Austin is spending the money. And the ethics, there's so many ethical violations in the way this whole thing was set up in the first place and what's now changed. It's just awful. If we could sue on the basis of ethics, my lawsuit would have been 3 times as long.
Let me ask you the last question, Bill, before we close, because I don't want to just seem that, our discussion is just, anti-everything. And I think there's a lot of really reasons to show that the premise of Project Connect, besides the substantive legal issues that you've raised, is just a flawed concept in what was sold to the voters on this. But that doesn't have to be the only way that Austin addresses, mobility and transportation, type issues. Setting aside the law, setting aside your lawsuit, but just in your experience as a former Travis County judge and a longtime leader in this community, is there a better way? What should we be doing as opposed to continuing forward with this billion-dollar boondoggle.
If I just put my policy hat off and forget my law degree, I look back and say, there was a guy on the ATP board. It's only 5 members of the AT board. One of them is Jeff Trevelyan, because he's there for Capital Metro, and the other one was Adler and then Watson representing the city, and there are only 3 citizens folks. But Tony Elkins was the one that was there handling the finance. He was on the original board, and he kept trying to make sense to them about how what you ought to do is more like what San Antonio is doing with the VIA rapid bus system. We can still get mass transit. We still need mass transit, but it doesn't have to be the most expensive and inefficient and disruptive system of light rail. What you do is you have dedicated lanes with more buses, and you start off with that for the first 5 or 10 years and see if you can build up the ridership. And then once you can prove that realistically you've got the ridership along those routes, that then if you think a rapid transit system is worth the money, then you can come back and do that later. But he resigned in March of this year because they wouldn't listen to him. And he's an expert and a strong advocate for light rail, but most importantly for mass transit. So what we've lost is the ability to do something other than what we've lost from a policy standpoint is leaders who were willing to insist that what is done could actually work and would be actually affordable. And you skip over those 2 points and go for some visionary thing. It may look good on your campaign poster and your commercials, and you may be able to BS a lot of people into following you, but you're not going to actually solve the problem. So from a policy standpoint, we need to rethink Project Connect so it actually works.
Well, I know our viewers are listening, and I hope our elected officials and city officials are listening as well. Bill, thank you so much. James, for joining us, and Bill, for your advocacy and you being a champion for just doing what's right here and your longstanding leadership in Austin and Travis County. So that's going to conclude our discussion here today, but stay tuned. A lot more to come in your lawsuit, and I really want to thank you for the issues you've raised and in laying it out here today for our discussion. So, friends, that's going to conclude our live stream today about Off the Rails. Did Austin mislead voters for Project Connect? Bill, thanks for joining us. James, your comments as well.
Thank you.
Everyone have a great day.
Thanks.